Welcome back to Innovation Essentials. This is module 6 of 8, and today we're going to be looking at one of my favorite topics, which is how to run low risk experiments. Now, I say this in the book, there's a chapter called If You Only Read One Chapter, and I'm going to apply that to this course. If you only watch one module, this one is the one to watch. They're all important. You can't separate them really, but there's something about experiments that just catches the imagination inside organizations, particularly with leaders and managers, because it suddenly democratizes innovation. It opens it up, it lowers the risk, and suddenly much more interesting ideas can be explored that previously couldn't. So hold on to your hats. This is going to be worth your time, I'm sure. So just a quick recap on what we looked at before. Module 5 was looking at bold idea generation, and we talked about this idea of culture being something that describes what is ordinary. It's the way that we do things around here. And yet there's an expectation that out of that ordinary environment, extraordinary ideas and outcomes are going to emerge. And we said, it's got to deal in reality here. That just doesn't happen. Great ideas, big ideas need human beings to be in the right state, and they need an environment that feels safe, where people can take risks without fear of repercussions that are going to be painful. So we covered off 6 pillars on a graphic equalizer, if you like, looking at the different dimensions that you can tweak very practically to help higher quality innovation and creativity show up. We particularly looked at 2 areas that I'm going to highlight here. One is, what is that human state? We're not robots, we're human beings, and it's proven beyond doubt that when we are in a certain state, we are much more likely to be more creative than if you've just been pulled out of a meeting and you're stressed and all of the things you can see on the screen. So creativity is biological warfare. It really is. So our challenge is, if we want bolder ideas, we've got to be serious about setting people up for success. And as part of that, we talked about this differentiation between what we call performance space and rehearsal space, taken from the show business world. Performance space, you're on stage, you can't drop the mic, you can't miss a note, it's got to be perfect. But backstage, before the show, in the rehearsal room, we're in a safe environment where we can make mistakes, try new stuff, improvise, and that's what we need more of in the corporate space. And we talked about how you can do that in the last module as well. So today we're assuming that you, as an idea generator, have got hold of a great idea, and now you want to get started with it. And what I would say is, just hold on, because our temptation at this stage is to go too big too soon, and we're going to see some of the dangers of that in a moment. So today is how to run a low risk experiments. And just to remind you, this is the stage that we've got to in the process. You've been through, hopefully, the process of getting some great insights, designing great questions that spark great ideas, and now we're going to do something quite exciting with them. If you're reading along with the book, doesn't matter if you're not, because you'll get value from this session anyway, but if you are, chapters 26 and 29 are the ones to look for. And we're going to be covering 3 things today. So first of all, we're going to look at the business case for experimentation, because the reality is, bolder ideas, when they work, they have great payback. And experimentation is a safe way to step into bolder innovation. So we're going to just look at some of the numbers and the stats around that. Secondly, we're going to look at something called innovation trapdoors. I call it that because the idea of assumptions and what we call leap of faith assumptions tends to be one of the biggest problems with innovation. We have an idea, we're desperate to get moving. What we haven't done yet is fully understood what are the dependencies that need to be true in order for this idea to actually work. And there are these leap of faith assumptions. This will only work if, finish that sentence. So what are those? How do we find them? Often they're hidden from our sight. So we're going to show you some tools on how to identify them. And thirdly, designing and running experiments. So some initial ideas and examples of how you can do that. Probably we all know from experience that the bolder the idea, the more likely it is going to fail, because we're dealing with more unknowns than we are when we're working with the status quo. And actually our ability to predict the future in general beyond, very far into the future, is pretty weak, especially when we're having to try and predict what human beings are going to do in the mix. So put something new in front of a person, what will they do? Generally, we don't anticipate that very well if it moves much beyond what we well understand in our day-to-day business. And this is backed up by lots of research. You can see in this diagram here, the further we move away from that bottom left-hand corner, our core business, where cause and effect is relatively well understood, we innovate in that space, we know more or less there's going to be a reasonably high success rate because we understand the dynamics of what's going on in that space. But the further we move away from our core customer, the further we move away from the products and technologies that we deeply understand today, we're starting to move into greater area of uncertainty, and we are bound to make choices that don't always work out. And so the likelihood of failure increases. And, this is instinctive, but actually I've found it's only when you put this on the screen, sometimes in a session, that people finally click with it and say, well, actually what I thought was true is actually true. So what I found is that when you are trying to take a bolder idea, something in that second third of this diagram, when you're trying to take that idea and move it through the business, one of three things typically happens. So the first is what I call dead on arrival. And this is the idea really, it's killed off before we ever knew whether it was worth exploring any further. And the main reason for that is that executives generally only want to invest in ideas that they know will work. And in the status quo, in the day-to-day business, that's somewhat acceptable because as I said, we're dealing with things that we understand well: the market, the customer dynamics, the product and the supply chain. But the further we move out from there, the less possible and realistic it is that we can make very accurate predictions. So typically what happens in this scenario is a leader will say, well, what's the business case? When is this going to start to make money? And usually it's far too early to be able to do that. And so without that business case, the idea dies. Now, I'm not against business cases. We'll come on to that a bit later. But dead on arrival is very common. The second is this idea of decision paralysis. No decision gets made. You're looking at the idea and no one knows what to do. One, often because there's no clear owner. Whose budget or team does this sit under? And secondly, it's just the fear of making a decision around something that's big and likely to fail. So we do nothing and it generally withers, or someone else beats us to market. That happens very, very often. Finally, those who are bold enough, they go too big too fast. We throw too many resources at the idea, often before we've really understood the problem that we're trying to solve and the dependencies that would need to be in place in order for that idea to succeed. But the reality is that if we can't overcome these responses to risk, we're increasing our vulnerability to what future trends could do to our business or our organization. And actually, we're leaving quite a lot of money on the table. There's some research here that I want to share with you. So we said I think in module 1 and 2, we were talking about how much of our innovation tends to be incremental, which is fine. We need some incremental innovation, but it's not enough to keep us in the game in the long term, because generally there are waves of disruption that come that catch us out. And that's The Innovator's Dilemma is a book that you should read if you're interested in that subject. The reality is, though, as other studies have shown, that even though a small amount of all product launches that happen are called substantial, or that we could call them disruptive or transformational, they account for 61% of all profit from all of the innovations that are examined. So they may only show up in small amount, a small proportion, but like for like, they deliver significant rewards. And again, I think we probably instinctively know this, and we think about gambling. High odds, if you win, then you win big. Or in a venture capital setup, you've got a portfolio that you're playing at any one time. And you know that there will be a level of ideas that deliver a lot of money, and there'll be many that fail. You're just working the numbers and you're playing the odds. And so, what do you do with this? We recognize that there's something here that's worth grasping, but still fear grips us. Now, this may or may not reassure you, but even companies like Google struggle with this, and they will openly tell you that they have a 90+% failure rate with their bolder ideas. And actually, it's the same everywhere. I look at the stats inside lots of organizations, and this is pretty typical. 90% plus of big ideas fail. But I really appreciate the way that Google thinks about it. They don't fall into the trap of being a victim or running away from that failure rate. Here's Astro Teller. He's I think he's called Captain of Moonshots, or at least used to be at Google X, which is the part of Google that does all of the crazy stuff. And what he says, I don't believe a mistake-free learning environment exists. Now, there is someone dealing in reality. Who can put their hand up and say they can predict the future with 100% accuracy? Well, nobody can. So let's be real about this. I find it refreshing inside Google that instead of allowing this reality to paralyze bold innovation at Google, they embrace it. And they assume that every bold idea is probably wrong right from the start. And based on their experience, most of them are. So with that reality in mind, their metric is to learn as quickly and as cheaply as possible which ideas are wrong, so that they can invest as much resource as possible in the few that are going to be right. And this is an approach that a growing number of companies are getting hold of now. It's figure out as quickly as possible the stuff that isn't right so that we can recalibrate our resources around the ones that are. And actually, if you read into this, there's a lot written about this inside the way that Google works now. You are rewarded for finding the failures rather than finding the big idea. Well, not rather than, but as much as. So Google talks about this idea of creating the path of least resistance to finding truth. And that truth can either be, actually, this was the wrong thing to pursue. We now know that this isn't something to invest in. Or it's, phew, we found the 1 in 100 that's actually right. We found it. We found the right answer. And they create a safe environment where it's safe to explore. And whatever the answer is, it's all good. It's interesting listening to Astro Teller talk about the reality of that. They're human beings working in Google as well. They don't always find it easy, but that's their ambition, to create that safe environment. So a quick recap, because this is so important and we often miss it at our peril. Pursuing bold ideas means you will be wrong a lot. You have to get hold of that, but so will everybody else. That's the truth. Most people are not doing well at this. So your choice to do it actually is going to give you a source of competitive advantage. Don't let the prospect of failure paralyze you. Make smart failure a source of competitive advantage. Be the best at failing well in your industry. And I don't mean let's do giant screw-ups. I mean, let's find out the answer to whether it's wrong or right as quickly and cheaply and as efficiently as possible so that we can invest in the stuff that is going to work in the future. Now, here comes the key idea for this introductory part. We may not have much control over the amount of failure. Everybody fails a lot when you move into this space, but we can definitely lower the stakes of failure. Now, this is crucial, because if we can lower the stakes of failure, suddenly it isn't as scary to propose a new idea to your boss. It's actually not as scary to raise your hand and suggest a contrary opinion, an original idea that challenges the way that we do business today. And suddenly it's safer to explore a new technology or a new paradigm shift that's coming into the industry, because we are massively lowering the stakes of failure and the pain in many dimensions is reduced. So let's start the process of looking at what that actually is. So innovation trapdoors, leap of faith assumptions.